Officer James Barrett knew every face in his perfect suburban beat, or so he thought. 15 years of patrol had taught him to trust his instincts about suspicious activity. But on a routine Wednesday afternoon, those same instincts led him to stop a teenage girl walking down Maple Street. It should have been just another tick mark in his daily log. Instead, it became the moment that shattered everything he thought he knew about protecting and serving. Officer James Barrett sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as he scanned the suburban streets of Millbrook Heights. The setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses, each one nearly identical to the next. He'd been working this beat for 15 years, and he prided himself on knowing every face, every car, and every potential threat to what he considered his perfect little slice of America. His radio crackled with routine updates, but his attention was drawn to a figure walking down Maple Street, a black teenage girl, maybe 16 or 17, wearing a backpack and carrying what looked like a gym bag. She wasn't running or acting suspicious, but something about her presence in this predominantly white neighborhood set off Barrett's internal alarm. He'd seen too many break-ins lately, too many reports of suspicious persons in the area. The neighborhood watch had been sending him countless messages about unfamiliar faces, and he'd made it his personal mission to investigate every single one. Some called him thorough. Others had less flattering terms for his particular brand of vigilance. Barrett pulled his cruiser alongside the girl, who continued walking at the same steady pace. He noticed she was wearing expensive-looking athletic wear, probably stolen, he thought automatically before catching himself, but the thought had already taken root. "Excuse me, miss," he called out through his opened window. "Mind if I have a word with you?" The girl stopped, turned toward him with an expression that mixed resignation, with barely concealed frustration. "Is something wrong, officer?" Barrett stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. "Just doing my routine checks. We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling me where you're headed?" "I'm going to Emma Barrett's house," she replied, her voice steady but tired, as if she'd been through this before. "We have a chemistry project due tomorrow." Barrett felt his stomach tighten at the mention of his daughter's name. "Emma Barrett? You know my daughter?" "Yes, sir. I'm Keisha Washington. We're lab partners in AP chemistry, and we're also on the track team together." She reached for her phone. "I can show you our text messages if you'd like." The situation suddenly felt surreal to Barrett. He'd heard Emma mention a friend named Keisha, but somehow he'd never made the connection. In his mind, Keisha had been, well, he hadn't really thought about what she looked like. He'd been too busy with work, too absent from his daughter's life to know her friends beyond passing mentions at dinner. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. But professional habit took over, and he added, "But I still need to see some ID." Keisha's shoulders slumped slightly, but she maintained her composure. She unzipped her backpack and pulled out her student ID card, along with her driver's permit. Barrett took them, studying the photos and information with unnecessary thoroughness. A car drove by slowly, and Barrett noticed the driver, Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over, watching the scene with obvious interest. He knew by tomorrow this would be all over the neighborhood Facebook group, though what version of events would be shared remained to be seen. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, handing back her identification. "You can proceed." "Thank you, officer," Keisha replied, her tone neutral, but her eyes conveying volumes. She adjusted her backpack and continued walking. Barrett stood there for a moment, watching her go. His radio crackled again, but he barely heard it. Instead, he was thinking about all the times Emma had mentioned Keisha, how she'd helped Emma improve her running form, their late-night study sessions over FaceTime, the way they'd both gotten perfect scores on their last chemistry exam. He got back in his car but didn't start it immediately. Instead, he pulled out his phone and opened his text conversation with Emma. The last message from her was from 3 days ago. "Working on chemistry project with Keisha this week. Don't wait up for dinner on Wednesday." Today was Wednesday. Barrett put his phone away and started his car. But instead of continuing his patrol, he sat there, remembering all the times he'd stopped young black men and women in this neighborhood. How many of them had been someone's lab partner, someone's teammate, someone's friend? How many times had he seen a threat where there was only a teenager trying to live their life? His thoughts were interrupted by another text from Emma. "Dad, did you just stop Keisha on her way to our house?" Barrett felt his face grow hot. He started typing a response, deleted it, started again. Before he could finish, another message came through. "She's been here like 1,000,000 times. She literally comes over every week. What is wrong with you?" The shame that had been building in his chest threatened to overwhelm him, but rather than face it directly, he fell back on his usual defense. "Just doing my job, sweetheart. There have been reports." Emma's response came quickly. "Don't even start with that. I know exactly what this is about, and it's not about reports." Barrett put his phone away, his hands shaking slightly. He could see Keisha approaching his house now, about to turn up the walkway to his front door. Through the window, he could see Emma waiting, her face illuminated by the warm light from inside. He watched as Emma opened the door before Keisha could even knock. The two girls hugged, and even from this distance he could see them talking animatedly. About him, no doubt. His daughter's body language spoke volumes about her anger. Barrett's radio crackled once more. "Dispatch to Unit 17. We've got a report of a suspicious person on Oak Street." His hand hovered over the radio. How many times had he responded to calls like this? How many times had "suspicious person" been code for something else entirely? He thought about Keisha's resigned expression, about how many times she must have been stopped, questioned, made to feel like she didn't belong in her own community. Looking at his house again, he could see Emma and Keisha settling at the dining room table, spreading out their books and laptops. They were laughing about something now, the earlier tension apparently forgotten in the way that teenagers often can move past moments that continue to haunt adults. The radio crackled again. "Unit 17, do you copy?" Barrett picked up the radio, his mind racing through years of ingrained responses and newly awakening realizations. The weight of his badge felt different somehow, heavier with the responsibility of what it truly meant to protect and serve, and who he had really been protecting all these years. His house lit up with warm light as the sun continued to set, casting long shadows across Maple Street. Through the window, he could see his daughter and Keisha working on their project, their heads bent together over their books, equals in every way that mattered. The scene stood in stark contrast to the one he had created just minutes ago on the street, and the disparity made his chest tighten with a mixture of shame and dawning understanding. The radio waited for his response, as did the endless parade of suspicious person reports that would surely follow. Barrett sat in his cruiser, caught between the world he had helped maintain and the one he was suddenly seeing with new eyes. His daughter's angry text messages continued to light up his phone, each one forcing him to confront truths he had long chosen to ignore. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the street in deepening shades of purple and blue. Barrett remained parked, watching his house, watching the girls study, watching his assumptions and biases play out in his mind like a movie he couldn't pause. Each passing minute brought new memories, new realizations, new questions about every decision he'd made in his 15 years on the force. A neighborhood watch alert popped up on his phone. Unknown teenage male walking on Oak Street, wearing a hoodie. The description continued, but Barrett didn't need to read the rest. He knew exactly what kind of alert this was, what kind of response was expected from him. The same kind of response he'd given countless times before, the kind that had led him to stop his own daughter's friend outside their house. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he sat in his cruiser, suspended between action and understanding, between the officer he had been and the one he needed to become. The radio crackled once more, waiting for his response, while inside his house, two teenagers continued their chemistry project, unaware that they were catalyzing a different kind of reaction altogether. Barrett finally reached for his radio. "Unit 17 responding. Show me unavailable for the next hour. Personal matter." He switched off his patrol lights and sat back, knowing he was postponing the inevitable confrontation waiting for him inside his house. Through the window, he could see Emma gesturing animatedly as she explained something to Keisha, who was nodding and taking notes. It reminded him of Emma's mother, Sarah, who had passed away 5 years ago. Sarah had always been the one to challenge his views, to push back against what she called his blind spots. After her death, he'd thrown himself into his work, using his badge and authority as a shield against the softer emotions he didn't want to face. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Captain Reynolds. "Barrett, got a complaint about you stopping a teenager on Maple Street. Need to discuss tomorrow." The captain's message was typically terse, but Barrett could read between the lines. This wasn't the first time his thorough policing had drawn attention. Finally, gathering his courage, Barrett stepped out of his cruiser and walked toward his house. As he approached, he could hear the girls' laughter through the open window, mixed with discussions about molecular structures and chemical bonds. He hesitated at the door, key in hand, feeling like a stranger in his own home. When he entered, the laughter stopped abruptly. Emma's face hardened into an expression he'd seen more and more lately, disappointment mixed with embarrassment. Keisha straightened in her chair, her body language shifting subtly from relaxed to alert. "Dad," Emma said, her voice tight, "nice of you to join us. Done harassing my friends for the day?" "Emma," he started, but she cut him off. "No, seriously. Do you know how embarrassing this is? Keisha's been coming here every Wednesday for months. She's been to my birthday parties. She was here for Christmas dinner last year." Barrett remembered now, the holiday dinner he'd barely attended, rushing off to work an extra shift he didn't really need to take. Had Keisha been there? Had he been so wrapped up in his own world that he hadn't even noticed? "Officer Barrett," Keisha spoke up, her voice measured and mature beyond her years. "I understand you were doing your job, but I think we both know what this was really about." The directness of her statement hit him like a physical blow. In his 15 years on the force, no one he'd stopped had ever confronted him so directly about his motivations. He looked at Keisha, really looked at her for the first time, and saw not a suspicious person, but a poised young woman wearing a Science Olympiad shirt, her textbook spread out neatly, a half-finished chemical equation sketched in precise handwriting. He began, then stopped. What could he say? That he hadn't recognized her? That would only make it worse, highlighting how little attention he'd paid to his daughter's life. That he was just following procedure? They all knew that wasn't true. "You know what the worst part is?" Emma continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Mom would be so disappointed. She always said we had to be better than this, that we had to see people, really see them." The mention of Sarah knocked the wind out of him. He sank into a chair at the dining room table, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too heavy. "I've known Keisha since freshman year," Emma went on. "She's the reason I didn't quit track when I kept losing races. She's the reason I got an A in chemistry last semester. She's been here for me more than—" She trailed off, but the unspoken accusation hung in the air. "More than you have." Barrett's phone buzzed again, another neighborhood watch alert. He pulled it out automatically, then stopped himself. Both girls were watching him, waiting to see what he would do. "I need to apologize," he said finally, looking at Keisha. "Not just for today, but for a lot of things." "With all due respect, Officer Barrett," Keisha replied, "I'm not sure an apology is enough. Do you know how many times I've been stopped in this neighborhood? How many times I've had to prove I belong here? And I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm a straight A student, I'm on the track team, I have all the right credentials. What about the kids who don't?" Her words hit home in a way that all of Sarah's gentle prodding never had. Barrett looked down at his badge, thinking about all it represented, or what it was supposed to represent. Emma stood up suddenly. "I'm getting some water. Keisha, want some?" "Sure," Keisha replied, not taking her eyes off Barrett. As Emma left the room, an uncomfortable silence fell. Through the window, Barrett could see another patrol car driving slowly down the street. He wondered if they were responding to the call he'd ignored, if they were about to stop another teenager who was just trying to live their life. "You know," Keisha said, breaking the silence, "Emma talks about you a lot, about how you used to be different before Mrs. Barrett passed away, about how you used to coach Little League and volunteer at the community center." Barrett remembered those days, before Sarah's death, before he'd let his grief and fear calcify into something harder and colder. Had he really changed that much? Or had these biases always been there, just waiting for an excuse to surface? Emma returned with the water glasses, setting them down, perhaps a bit harder than necessary. Some water splashed onto Keisha's chemistry notes, and both girls moved quickly to save their papers. The normalcy of the moment, two teenagers worried about their homework getting wet, contrasted sharply with the weight of the conversation. Barrett's radio crackled again, and all three of them jumped slightly at the sound. Another call, another report of a suspicious person. He reached for the radio, then stopped, leaving it unanswered. Instead, he found himself asking, "Keisha, would you tell me about these other times you've been stopped in the neighborhood?" The question hung in the air as both girls looked at him with surprise. Outside, the patrol car passed by again, moving slower this time. Barrett could feel the weight of everything left unsaid pressing down on the room, could see the years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding reflected in both girls' eyes. He waited, knowing that whatever Keisha might say next could change everything, not just for him, but for every officer who patrolled these streets, for every teenager who just wanted to visit a friend, for every community that needed to heal. Keisha set down her pen carefully, as if buying time to organize her thoughts. "The first time was when I was 14, she began. "I was walking to Emma's house for the first time. Mrs. Barrett had to come out and verify who I was. The second time was after track practice. I was still in my uniform, but that didn't matter to Officer Richards. The third time was at the neighborhood block party last summer." As Keisha spoke, Barrett felt each incident like a physical blow. Some of the officers she named were his friends, people he'd worked with for years. He'd never questioned their judgment, had defended them when complaints were filed. How many times had he been complicit in perpetuating the very system he was now beginning to question? "And you know what's ironic?" Keisha continued, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "My dad's a judge. My mom's a pediatric surgeon. We live in Highland Park. Our house is probably bigger than most of the ones here, but none of that matters when I'm walking down these streets. All anyone sees is a threat," Barrett finished quietly. "We see a threat." "No, Dad," Emma interrupted. "You see a threat. You and the other officers who've never bothered to know anything about the people you're supposedly protecting." Barrett's radio crackled again, but this time it was Captain Reynolds' voice. "Unit 17, need your location for a debrief on that earlier incident." Before Barrett could respond, the front door opened and his partner, Officer Mike Sullivan, stepped into the house. Sullivan had a key for emergencies. They'd been partners for 8 years, and Barrett had trusted him with his life countless times. "Jim, everything okay? You weren't responding to calls, and with that complaint coming in." Sullivan trailed off as he took in the scene. The chemistry book spread across the table. The two teenagers, Barrett's obvious discomfort. "Mike," Barrett said, standing up, "this is Keisha Washington, my daughter's best friend, the suspicious person I stopped earlier." Sullivan's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, embarrassment. Oh shit. He looked at Keisha. "You're Judge Washington's daughter? The one who won the state science fair last year?" "Yes, sir," Keisha replied coolly, "though I'm curious why that matters." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sullivan shifted uncomfortably, and Barrett could see his partner going through the same mental gymnastics he'd been practicing for years. The instant categorization of people into threatening and non-threatening based on their credentials, their connections, their proximity to power. Emma stood up again, this time moving to stand beside Keisha. "Officer Sullivan, since you're here, maybe you'd like to hear about all the times you and your officers have stopped Keisha in our neighborhood. Or should we call her father and have this conversation at the courthouse?" "Emma," Barrett warned, but his heart wasn't in it. His daughter's righteous anger was a mirror of her mother's, and for the first time in years, he felt proud rather than defensive. "No, she's right," Sullivan said, surprising everyone. "We should hear it, all of it." He pulled out a small notebook, the kind officers use to take witness statements. "Ms. Washington, would you be willing to make an official statement about your experiences in this neighborhood?" Keisha looked at Emma, then at Barrett, then back at Sullivan. "Will it make any difference?" "It will," Barrett said firmly, finding his voice, "because I'll make sure it does, starting with my own report about today's incident." Sullivan's eyebrows shot up. "Jim, are you sure? That could what?" Barrett interrupted. "Force us to confront our biases? Make us actually think about who we're stopping and why? Good. It's about time." His phone buzzed yet again, another neighborhood watch alert. But this time, Barrett picked up his phone and did something he'd never done before. He clicked the Leave Group button on the neighborhood watch chat. The simple action felt both insignificant and monumental. Emma noticed what he'd done and gave him a small, approving nod. "Okay," Keisha said, straightening in her chair. "Let me tell you about what it's like to be a black teenager in this neighborhood." She paused, then added, "But first, let me finish this chemistry equation, because unlike some people's assumptions, I actually care about my education." The subtle jab wasn't lost on either officer. Sullivan pulled up a chair, notebook ready, while Barrett remained standing, feeling the weight of his badge more acutely than ever. Outside, the street was growing darker, and he could see other patrol cars passing by, officers doing what he had done countless times, looking for threats that existed primarily in their own minds. In his pocket, his phone started buzzing again. Captain Reynolds would be wanting answers. The neighborhood watch would be spreading stories. His fellow officers would be questioning his judgment. But for perhaps the first time in his career, Barrett wasn't concerned about any of that. Instead, he was focused on the two teenagers at his dining room table, one his daughter, one a girl he should have known as well as a daughter, and the story they were about to tell. The chemistry books lay forgotten as Keisha began to speak, her words filling the room with truths that had long gone unspoken in this house, in this neighborhood, in this department. Barrett listened, really listened, knowing that whatever came next would change not just his relationship with his daughter and her friend, but his entire understanding of what it meant to protect and serve. The worst part isn't even being stopped, Keisha explained, her voice steady as she detailed incident after incident. It's the way people watch you afterward, the way they peek through their curtains when you walk by, the way they clutch their bags closer in the convenience store, the way they cross the street when they see you coming. Sullivan's pen moved rapidly across his notebook, his face growing increasingly troubled with each new detail. Barrett remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, a habit from his academy days that now felt like a shield against the uncomfortable truths being laid bare in his dining room. There was this one time, Keisha continued, when I was waiting for Emma outside the library. A woman called the police because she said I was lurking. I was reading a book on quantum physics. Emma interjected, "I remember that day. Officer Martinez made you empty your backpack right there on the sidewalk, in front of everyone." Barrett felt his stomach turn. Martinez was another officer he'd defended countless times during department reviews. How many other incidents had he dismissed, explained away, or actively covered up? The sound of another patrol car passing by drew everyone's attention to the window. Through the glass, they could see Mrs. Henderson from next door, phone in hand, obviously recording the scene inside Barrett's house. "And there it is," Keisha said quietly. "That's going to be all over the neighborhood Facebook group within the hour. Police questioning suspicious teenagers in Officer Barrett's house." Sullivan closed his notebook and rubbed his eyes. This is more than just a few isolated incidents. This is systematic." "You think?" Emma's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And you know what makes it worse? Everyone involved will say they're not racist. They'll talk about community safety and reasonable suspicion and just doing their jobs." She looked directly at her father as she spoke. Barrett moved to the window and drew the curtains, blocking Mrs. Henderson's view. As he did so, his radio crackled once again. "All units, be advised of suspicious activity reported in the vicinity of Maple Street. Multiple teenagers gathering." He switched off his radio completely. "They're talking about the study group," Emma explained. "Jasmine and Marcus are coming over too. We have a big test tomorrow." Barrett and Sullivan exchanged looks. Jasmine Chen and Marcus Rodriguez, more of Emma's friends he realized he'd never really known. "How many times have they been stopped?" Barrett asked, dreading the answer. "Marcus stopped keeping count after the first dozen times," Keisha replied. "Jasmine usually gets a pass because, in her words, Asians are the good minorities." The bitterness in her voice was palpable. She hates that even more than being stopped. A knock at the door made everyone tense. Emma went to answer it, and moments later, Jasmine and Marcus entered the dining room, both stopping short at the sight of the two police officers. "It's okay," Emma assured them. They're learning." Marcus, a tall boy wearing his debate team hoodie, looked skeptically at Barrett and Sullivan. "Learning what exactly?" "The truth," Barrett said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "About how we've been policing this neighborhood, about the assumptions we've been making, about the harm we've been causing." Jasmine set her backpack down carefully. "Is this because of what happened with Keisha earlier? My mom saw the posts on WeChat. She said I shouldn't come, that it might not be safe with police here." The irony of that statement, that the police presence made people feel less safe, not more, hit Barrett like a physical blow. Sullivan stood up, his notebook full of Keisha's testimony, feeling heavier than his service weapon. "I should get back to the station, file this report." He paused, looking at the teenagers. Unless there's more you all want to add? Marcus pulled out a chair. Oh, I've got some stories for you. Starting with last week when your Officer Ramirez followed me for 6 blocks because I was walking suspiciously. I was practicing my debate presentation. Barrett watched as his partner sat back down, opening to a fresh page in his notebook. The chemistry books remained untouched as one by one, the teenagers began sharing their experiences. Each story was different, yet painfully similar. Tales of being watched, stopped, questioned, searched, all for the crime of existing in a space where others had decided they didn't belong. Through the drawn curtains, Barrett could still see the occasional flash of headlights as patrol cars passed by, responding to the calls about suspicious teenagers that were, in reality, his daughter's study group. He thought about all the times he'd responded to similar calls, never questioning the underlying assumptions, never considering the impact on the young people he was supposedly protecting. His phone had stopped buzzing, likely because Captain Reynolds had given up trying to reach him. Tomorrow would bring consequences, he knew. Questions would be asked, reports would be filed, decisions would have to be made. But for now, he stood in his dining room, listening to the voices of teenagers who had been silenced for too long, watching his partner document truths that should have been acknowledged years ago. Emma caught his eye and gave him a look that was part challenge, part hope, so much like her mother that it made his heart ache. The night was far from over, and the real work, he realized, was just beginning. Outside, the neighborhood watch chat was undoubtedly buzzing with activity, spreading rumors and concerns about the gathering at Officer Barrett's house. But inside, something else was spreading. Understanding, painful but necessary, like antiseptic on a long-infected wound. As the night wore on, the chemistry books remained forgotten while more stories poured out. Marcus was in the middle of describing his third encounter with Officer Ramirez when Captain Reynolds himself appeared at the front door. "Barrett," he called through the door. "We need to talk, now." The teenagers fell silent, tension filling the room. Barrett looked at his daughter, then at Sullivan, who gave him a subtle nod. "Come in, Captain," Barrett called back. "There are some people you need to meet." Reynolds entered, his commanding presence filling the doorway. He was still in his dress uniform, likely having come straight from a community relations meeting, the irony of which wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "What's going on here?" Reynolds demanded, taking in the scene. Sullivan with his notebook, the group of teenagers, the drawn curtains. "I've got the neighborhood watch blowing up my phone about suspicious activity at your house, and you're not responding to calls." "Captain," Barrett said, stepping forward, "I'd like you to meet my daughter Emma's friends. This is Keisha Washington, Judge Washington's daughter, Marcus Rodriguez, who just won the state debate championship, Jasmine Chen, who's headed to MIT next fall. They're here to study chemistry, but right now, they're teaching us something far more important." Reynolds' expression shifted slightly at the mention of Judge Washington. "Barrett, if this is about that stop earlier—" "It's about every stop," Keisha interrupted, her voice clear and confident. "Every time your officers have profiled us, questioned us, made us feel like criminals in our own community. Officer Sullivan has been taking our statements." Sullivan held up his notebook, now filled with pages of testimony. "Sir, I think you need to hear this." Reynolds looked from Sullivan to Barrett, then to the teenagers. His face was unreadable, years of police training having taught him to mask his reactions. But something in his posture changed as he took in the scene before him. "Go ahead," he said finally, pulling up a chair. "I'm listening." Jasmine spoke up first this time. 2 months ago, one of your officers stopped me outside the public library. He said someone had reported an Asian girl looking through car windows. I was trying to find my mom's car because she'd moved it while I was studying inside. The officer made me call my mother to verify my story, even though I had my student ID and driver's license. "Officer Brooks," Reynolds said quietly. "I remember the incident report. But did the report mention how he spoke to me? How he told me I should be grateful he was being patient with me? How he said that your people usually know better than to cause trouble?" Reynolds' pen appeared in his hand, and he began taking his own notes. Marcus leaned forward. "Or how about last month, when 3 of your patrol cars surrounded me while I was jogging? I was training for track, but they said I matched the description of someone who'd been breaking into houses. The only description they had was young black male." The captain's pen paused. I don't recall that incident being reported. Because they didn't file one, Sullivan interjected, just like dozens of other stops that never make it into the official record. Barrett watched his superior officer's face carefully. Reynolds had been on the force for 30 years, had risen through the ranks preaching community policing and transparency. But how much had he really known about what was happening on his streets? Emma, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. "You know what's funny, Captain Reynolds? When Mom was alive, she used to talk about you. She said you were one of the good ones, that you really cared about making things better. She told me about how you pushed for body cameras before they were mandatory, how you started the Community Oversight Committee." Reynolds' expression softened at the mention of Sarah Barrett. "Your mother was a remarkable woman. She never let us forget our responsibility to the community." "Then honor her memory," Emma said firmly. "Listen to what's really happening in your jurisdiction. Not just the sanitized reports that cross your desk, but the real experiences of the people you're supposed to protect." Through the window, they could see more patrol cars gathering outside, their lights casting rotating patterns of blue and red across the living room walls. The neighborhood watch had done its job well, alerting everyone to the situation at Officer Barrett's house. "Sir," Barrett said, making a decision that would likely change the course of his career, "I'd like to file a formal complaint against myself for today's incident with Keisha, and then I'd like to help review every stop, every search, every suspicious person report we've responded to in the past year." Sullivan stood up. "I'll help. These kids' stories, they're not isolated incidents. This is a pattern, and we've all been part of it." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, looking around the room at each face in turn. Outside, the patrol cars continued to accumulate, and phones could be seen recording through windows across the street. Whatever happened next would not stay within these walls. "All right," he said finally. "Ms. Washington, would you be willing to come down to the station tomorrow with your father? Mr. Rodriguez, Ms. Chen, bring your parents too. Let's do this officially, on the record." He paused, then added, "And Barrett, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about reforming our community policing protocols." The tension in the room shifted, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something else, something that felt, cautiously, like hope. "Now," Reynolds continued, standing up, "I believe I need to go address the small army of officers gathering outside and explain why they're responding to calls about a study group." He headed for the door, then turned back. "And kids, good luck on your chemistry test tomorrow." As Reynolds left, Barrett could hear him on his radio, calling off the patrol cars, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaos that had built up outside. But inside, the real work was just beginning. The teenagers exchanged looks, equal parts suspicious and hopeful, while Sullivan continued taking notes. Barrett looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the same determination that Sarah had always shown when confronting injustice. The chemistry book still lay unopened on the table, but somehow, he thought, this might be the most important lesson any of them had learned in a long time. The night was far from over, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, in this room, something was changing, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The question was, would it be enough? As Captain Reynolds dealt with the situation outside, the group inside remained quiet, processing everything that had just happened. The silence was broken by the buzz of Keisha's phone. "It's my dad," she said, looking at the screen. "Someone sent him a video of Officer Barrett stopping me earlier." She paused, reading the message. "He wants to know if I'm okay, and he's coming over." Barrett felt his stomach tighten. Judge Washington's arrival would escalate this situation beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first pulled his patrol car alongside Keisha that afternoon. "Good," Emma said firmly. "Maybe then something will actually change." Sullivan closed his notebook and stood up. "I should go help the captain deal with the crowd outside. Jim, you might want to prepare for this to go public. Fast." He gestured to the windows, where several phones were still visible recording the scene. Before Barrett could respond, another car pulled up outside, a sleek black BMW. Judge Andre Washington stepped out, his imposing figure drawing immediate attention from the gathered officers and onlookers. "Dad's here," Keisha said quietly. Barrett straightened his uniform unconsciously. He'd appeared in Judge Washington's courtroom several times over the years to testify in cases, but this was different. This was personal. The doorbell rang, and Emma went to answer it. Judge Washington entered the room, his expression stern but controlled. He was still wearing his court attire, having clearly come straight from the courthouse. "Officer Barrett," he said, his deep voice filling the room, "I believe we need to have a conversation about what happened today." "Yes, Your Honor," Barrett replied, fighting the urge to stand at attention. "We do." "Dad," Keisha started, but the judge held up a hand. "First, I want to see this video that's circulating." He pulled out his phone and played the clip someone had recorded of Barrett stopping Keisha earlier. The footage was shaky but clear enough, showing Barrett's initial approach, the questioning, the demand for ID. As they watched, Barrett saw his actions through new eyes, the way he'd positioned his patrol car to block Keisha's path, his hand resting near his weapon, his aggressive stance, all textbook police procedure that suddenly looked very different when viewed from the other side. "This isn't the first time my daughter has been stopped in this neighborhood," Judge Washington said after the video ended. "But it is the first time the officer involved was the father of her best friend." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus and Jasmine exchanged glances, clearly wondering if they should leave, but Emma shook her head slightly. They were all part of this now. "Your Honor," Sullivan spoke up from near the door, "we've been taking statements from the kids about their experiences with law enforcement in this area. The pattern of behavior, it's troubling." Judge Washington turned to Sullivan, his expression unchanged. "Troubling? Officer Sullivan, I've been handling cases involving police misconduct for 20 years. Troubling doesn't begin to cover it." He turned back to Barrett. "Do you know what it's like, Officer Barrett, to give your child the talk? Not about birds and bees, but about how to survive an encounter with law enforcement? To tell your straight-A student, your track star, your science fair champion that none of those achievements matter if she meets the wrong officer on the wrong day?" Barrett felt each word like a physical blow. He looked at Keisha, remembering all the times she'd been in his house, all the times he'd barely acknowledged her presence, too busy rushing off to patrol the very neighborhoods where she was made to feel unwelcome. 4 years ago, Judge Washington continued, I sentenced a young man to 12 years for assaulting a police officer during a stop. The officer testified that the young man had acted aggressively, had reached for something in his pocket. It turned out to be a phone. He was trying to call his mother, just like you made my daughter do today. The judge's professional demeanor cracked slightly. That officer's testimony seemed credible at the time. Now I wonder how many other credible testimonies I've heard were based on the same kind of assumptions I saw in that video. Outside, the crowd had grown larger despite Captain Reynolds' efforts. News vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes visible above the patrol cars. "This isn't going away quietly," Sullivan observed, looking out the window. "No," Judge Washington agreed, "it's not, and maybe it shouldn't." He looked at the teenagers gathered around the table. These children deserve better than having to prove their right to exist in their own community. Barrett's phone buzzed. A message from his union representative. "Say nothing to anyone," lawyer being assigned. He ignored it. "Your Honor," he said, finding his voice, "I can't change what I did today, or what I've done over the past 15 years, but I can change what happens next." "Dad," Emma interjected, "tell him about what you did earlier, about leaving the neighborhood watch group." Judge Washington raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Barrett explained his small act of rebellion, feeling somewhat foolish about presenting it as significant in the face of everything else. But the judge nodded thoughtfully. "Small steps matter, Officer Barrett, but they're not enough." He turned to Keisha. "Sweetheart, are you okay to stay here and finish your studying? Your mother and I need to have a long conversation with Officer Barrett and Captain Reynolds." Keisha looked at Emma, then back at her father. "Actually, Dad, I think we all need to be part of this conversation. This affects all of us." From outside came the sound of more cars arriving, more voices joining the growing crowd. The night that had started with a routine patrol was becoming something much bigger, something that none of them could control or predict. Barrett looked around his dining room, at his daughter and her friends, at his partner still taking notes, at the judge whose daughter he'd profiled without a second thought, and realized that whatever happened next would define not just his career, but his legacy as both an officer and a father. The chemistry books remained untouched on the table, a reminder of the normal teenage evening that had been disrupted. But perhaps, Barrett thought, Some lessons were more important than chemistry. The question was, were they all ready to learn them? A sharp knock at the door interrupted the tense scene. Captain Reynolds entered, his face grave. "We've got media outlets setting up outside. The video of the stop has gone viral, and there's already a hashtag trending locally." He looked at Judge Washington. "Your Honor, I apologize for this situation." "Don't apologize to me, Captain," the judge replied. "Apologize to these children. Better yet, do something to ensure this stops happening." Before Reynolds could respond, Keisha's phone buzzed again. She looked at it and sat up straighter. "The video just got picked up by a national news network. They're asking for comments." She paused, reading further. "And the police department's past stop records for this neighborhood have been leaked online." Sullivan moved to look over her shoulder at the phone. "Those are internal documents. How did they—" "Does it matter?" Emma interrupted. "Now everyone can see what's been happening here. All the suspicious person reports, all the stops, all the profiling. It's all out there." Barrett's union representative called again. This time, Barrett answered and put it on speaker. "Jim, do not say another word to anyone. We're sending—" "No," Barrett interrupted. "I'm not hiding behind the union on this. What I did was wrong, and I'm going to face it." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line before the call disconnected. Judge Washington nodded approvingly. "That's a start, Officer Barrett, but it's only a start." Marcus, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "You know what's ironic? We're supposed to be studying chemical reactions tonight, but instead, we're watching a different kind of reaction, one where years of built-up pressure are finally releasing." "And like any chemical reaction," Jasmine added, drawing on their AP chemistry knowledge, "once it starts, you can't just put the reactants back in their original containers. Change is inevitable." The judge looked at the teenagers with newfound appreciation. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured, then, more loudly, "Captain Reynolds, I think it's time we address the media. But first, I want to hear your plan for concrete changes in your department." Reynolds loosened his collar slightly. "Your Honor, And please," the judge continued, "don't tell me about sensitivity training or community outreach programs. We've tried those. They clearly haven't worked." "What if," Barrett said slowly, an idea forming, "we started by having these students, and others like them, design the training? Who better to tell us what needs to change than the people who've been affected by our failures?" Emma's eyes widened. "Dad, are you serious?" "Absolutely." Barrett turned to the teenagers. "You've all experienced this firsthand. You know what needs to change better than any consultant we could bring in." Sullivan was already writing in his notebook again. "We could start a youth advisory council, give them real power to review policies, body camera footage, complaint reports." "And make it paid positions," Reynolds added, surprising everyone. "If we're asking for their expertise, we should compensate them for it." Judge Washington's stern expression softened slightly. "Now, that's the kind of concrete proposal I like to hear. But," he added, looking at the teenagers, "only if you're willing. This wouldn't be easy work." Keisha looked at her friends, then at Emma, before turning to her father. "We've been doing this work our whole lives, Dad. The only difference is now, maybe someone will actually listen." Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. Community members were starting to gather alongside the media, holding hastily made signs demanding accountability. The neighborhood that had been so quick to report suspicious persons was now witnessing the consequences of those reports in real time. Barrett's phone buzzed yet again, this time with a message from the police commissioner requesting his presence at an emergency meeting in the morning. But looking at the faces of the teenagers around his dining room table, he knew this couldn't wait until morning. Change was happening now, ready or not. "Captain," he said, "I think it's time we face the media, but not alone." He looked at the teenagers. "If you're willing, I think your voices need to be heard first." "Actually," Jasmine said, pulling out her laptop, "I've been taking notes this whole time. What if we drafted a joint statement, something that acknowledges what happened but also lays out a clear path forward?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "We could structure it like a debate presentation. Problem, evidence, solution. And we can use the leaked statistics to support our points," Keisha added, already pulling up the data on her phone. Emma looked at her father. "Is this okay? Are you ready for what might happen?" Barrett thought about his career, about the comfortable patterns he'd fallen into, about the assumptions he'd never questioned. Then he looked at these teenagers, bright, capable, and far too experienced in dealing with systemic injustice. "I'm ready," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "The real question is the department ready for what you all are about to teach us?" Judge Washington checked his watch. "The 9 o'clock news starts in 40 minutes. That's your deadline for the statement." He looked at the teenagers. "Think you can handle it?" Their response was immediate. Laptops opening, phones being used to research similar cases, ideas flowing freely. The chemistry test tomorrow seemed far less important now, though ironically, they were about to give their community a masterclass in how chain reactions work. The night was far from over, and the real test was just beginning. But as Barrett watched these young people take charge of the narrative, he realized that maybe, just maybe, real change was finally possible. The final draft of the statement was completed with 5 minutes to spare. As they stepped outside to face the media, Barrett was struck by how different everything looked. The same street he'd patrolled thousands of times now seemed transformed by the presence of community members, reporters, and activists who had gathered in response to the viral video. Keisha stepped up to the microphones first, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Keisha Washington. Today, I was stopped by Officer James Barrett while walking to his house, where I've been going every Wednesday for the past 2 years to study with his daughter. This isn't just about one stop, or one officer, or one afternoon. This is about a system that needs to change." The teenagers took turns reading their carefully crafted statement, outlining both problems and solutions. Marcus presented the statistics from the leaked reports, while Jasmine detailed their proposal for the Youth Advisory Council. Emma spoke last, her voice trembling slightly as she described watching her father's transformation over the course of one evening. Then it was Barrett's turn. He stepped forward, removed his badge, and held it up for all to see. "This badge represents a promise to protect and serve. Tonight, I learned that I've been breaking that promise for years without even realizing it. Starting tomorrow, I'll be taking a leave of absence to work with these remarkable young people on reforming our department's approach to community policing, not as an officer, but as a student." Captain Reynolds announced the immediate suspension of the Neighborhood Watch program pending review, and the establishment of the Youth Advisory Council with full oversight powers. Judge Washington closed by announcing his intention to review cases involving suspicious person stops in his jurisdiction. Later that night, as the crowd dispersed and the news vans packed up, the teenagers finally returned to their chemistry books. But something had fundamentally changed. Barrett watched as they studied, their conversation moving seamlessly between chemical equations and plans for their first advisory council meeting. "Dad," Emma said as she walked her friends to the door at the end of the night, "Mom would be proud of you, not for what happened earlier, but for what you did after." Keisha turned back before leaving. "Officer Barrett, thank you for listening, really listening." "Thank you for teaching me," he replied. "All of you." After everyone had gone, Barrett sat alone in his dining room, looking at his badge on the table. Beside it lay Sullivan's notebook, filled with testimonies that would help drive real change. His phone had finally stopped buzzing with messages from the union and department brass. Tomorrow would bring those battles. But tonight had brought something more important: understanding. Like the chemistry reactions his daughter and her friends had been studying, change had required the right elements coming together: justice, courage, youth, wisdom, and perhaps, most importantly, the willingness to learn. A week later, Barrett attended his first Youth Advisory Council meeting, not in uniform, but in civilian clothes. The room was filled with young people from throughout the community, each with stories to tell and ideas to share. Keisha, Emma, Marcus, and Jasmine sat at the head of the table, leading the discussion with the confidence of those who knew their time had come. The chemistry test, by the way, had gone well. All 4 had aced it. "It's because we understand chain reactions now," Emma had joked. But watching them lead the meeting, Barrett realized they understood something far more important. The chemical reaction of change, once started, couldn't be stopped. And perhaps that was the real lesson of that Wednesday evening, that sometimes the most important education happens not in textbooks or patrol cars, but in the moments when we finally open our eyes to the truth around us. For Barrett, it had taken his daughter's friend walking down the wrong street at the right time to catalyze a reaction that would transform not just his department, but his entire understanding of what it meant to protect and serve. As he sat in that meeting, taking notes just as Sullivan had done that night, Barrett thought about all the other officers who needed to learn these lessons. Change wouldn't be easy or quick, but looking at these young leaders, he knew it was inevitable. Sometimes the best moral lessons come not from being right, but from recognizing when you've been wrong and having the courage to do something about it. For Officer James Barrett, that lesson began with a routine patrol and ended with an understanding that would reshape not just his career, but his entire community. The chemistry book still sat on his dining room table at home, a reminder that education comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important reactions aren't the ones we study in school, but the ones that transform our hearts and minds when we least expect it.